Good morning, good afternoon, everybody around the world, including some good evenings. My name is David Marsh. I'm the chairman of OMFIF. I'm really pleased that we're going to have a 1-hour conversation with Mr. Charles Emmons, who is the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He is something of a lifer when it comes to the FOMC because he was previously, before he took over as the president, he was on the research side at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. He's been president now for 13 years, since September 2007, which I think makes you, Charlie, the longest serving, the most long-lived member of the FOMC that we have up to now. You've seen a lot in that time. You've not seen anything quite like the pandemic. This is all on the record. It's also being streamed by our friends at Bloomberg. I'd like to pass over straight away to Charlie for you to give us your brief 5-minute summing up of where are we in the US economy, what's going on there, what is the Fed doing about the downturn, what are we expecting from fiscal policy. Over to you, Charlie. Thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, thanks very much, David. And it's really, it's always delightful to participate in one of the OMFIF sessions, and I look forward to someday being able to get back together in person and having closer conversations. But this is definitely a productive environment, so I appreciate it. You mentioned that I've been president for 13 years. That's correct. You mentioned that I'm the longest serving. It turns out that's not exactly correct. My colleague Eric Rosengren has 6 weeks seniority on me, being appointed just before me, also in 2007. That reminds me of something that I found a little funny during the current event. I saw an early event that he did with the Boston Chamber of Commerce, and the person who introduced President Rosengren said, "We are so fortunate to have someone with his tenure because he's already been through one downturn that obviously will serve us all very well." I was providing the same kind of commentary to somebody who was going to introduce me, and I said, if you'd like to sort of say, geez, since it took so long after the last downturn, maybe we need new talent in place, that would be a not unreasonable response as well. It's a very challenging environment, obviously. Let me just briefly give you my take on where I think the US economy is right now, and remind everybody that as recently as the end of 2019, early this year, the US economy was really, the fundamentals were good. Monetary policy had sort of repositioned for a risk management setting where we thought that underlying economy was good. Unemployment was 3.5%. The consumer was very strong, but manufacturing was struggling, and it was in part due to global uncertainty, trade, tariff issues that were kind of slowing down otherwise even stronger momentum. Nevertheless, the US was in a good position. Then the COVID-19, the virus, novel coronavirus came along, and obviously that's been a tragic setting. We owe so much, everyone, to brave healthcare responders, people who have taken care and helped everyone, essential workers, through this time. And we shut down many parts of the U.S. economy and around the world in order to get on top of the virus in the spring, and obviously that led to a very substantial downturn in the second quarter, and that was global. Then we've been coming back from that and trying to deal with the virus. I would say the thing that has surprised me the most is the way that the U.S. has been able to continue to grow and get back to about 90% of an economy like we were before, even though the toll has been horrific. We are approaching 200,000 deaths in the United States. And if somebody had told me back in June when I submitted my forecast that come September there'd be a substantial increase in the number of deaths in the United States, I would not have expected to be marking up my forecast. But in fact, the recovery has proceeded stronger than that. There are a number of sectors in the US, around the world, that have advantages in the sense that they can produce goods in a factory setting with social distancing, with masks. The employers take precautions to keep the workers safe, and they don't interact directly with end user customers that much, and so they're able to produce, get production back. Manufacturing is largely come way back. The auto sector in the US economy has really come back a lot. Now, part of that is different mobility patterns, and the other part of the advantaged sectors are office workers who can work from home. And you set up a new digital set up it at home if you've got the space. Now, obviously, if you're a younger worker in an urban setting sharing an apartment with somebody, it's a lot more challenging in order to work from that cramped environment. But a large number of workers in the US and around the world are doing that. And so those are the advantaged sectors, I would say, and they've really come back. But there are many disadvantaged sectors, and those usually are working directly with end user customers, travel, leisure, hospitality, services, things like that. Those are really struggling during this time. Social distancing is so important in order to keep virus at bay. And, that's sort of what we're, challenged with. I would say during this time period, fiscal policy has been an important support to help people be able to stay at home. If you have to go back to work in order to pay your rent, put food on the table, take care of your family, and if it can't be done safely, then that's risking everyone in the community by spreading the virus. And so I think that the fiscal support in the US and around the world was unbelievably important early on. And it sort of set the table for us to have better control of the virus. And I think in the US that was more challenging because we had differential behavioral experiences around our country. And when that's the case, and given the way that we move around our country, then the virus spreads from one region to the next. And so I think we've been really challenged in that environment. Having said all of that, US economy, I'm expecting at the end of this year, the unemployment rate is going to be 7.5%, maybe 7%. We're at a little over 8% unemployment right now, and it's really come back a lot better. The key issue is going to be how many workers are going to be able to reattach to their previous employers so that the scarring of being furloughed is not a permanent situation, so that they don't have to rematch with somebody else. To the extent that they can go back to previous employers, then we can get back to much lower unemployment rates more quickly. I have an outlook for next year that assumes that we're going to get back to about 5.5% unemployment at the end of next year. That's premised on additional fiscal support. It's premised on a vaccine becoming available mid-year next year, a little bit later, and then the time that it takes to adopt that. But I think that a burst of enthusiasm that comes from that helps take the unemployment rate down a little bit more than just Okun's calculation would do. I think inflation during this environment is going to continue to be challenged to meet our 2% objective. I think we're going to underrun that for a number of years, and that means that monetary policy will continue. It'll be necessary for us to maintain accommodative monetary policy to get inflation back up to 2% and to actually overshoot after a long enough period of underrunning 2%. So those are the basic contours of my outlook. I think I'll turn it over to you to probe a little bit more and have a conversation wherever it may lead us.
Thanks very much. And we'll be joined also in about 15 minutes by our US chairman, veteran Treasury official who's left the Treasury a couple of years ago, Mark Sobel, who wants to drill down a bit more. But first of all, just to get the right balance between the fiscal and the monetary side, you say your forecasts are premised on a vaccine next year and also on adequate fiscal support. How worried are you that the Congress is not going to step up to the plate for whatever reason before the presidential election, and they may not be this hoped for substantial extra fiscal stimulus? How much of a worry is that for you and the rest of the FOMC?
Well, I think every week and every month that we go without renewing additional fiscal support that we saw strongly, sent out in the spring and summer, that we risk a longer period of slow growth, if not outright recessionary dynamics. And so I think it's very important that we have an understanding of that. There are a large number of unemployed workers who have rent payments to make, mortgages to pay, and I just think that the foreclosures that could come from all of that, the displacement. I think that commercial real estate is going to be challenged because people won't be paying their rent. Remember, we've got an awful lot of storefronts that aren't really earning the revenues that they would normally be earning. There's a lot of takeout business, but for restaurants, but it's not a thriving business by any means. And how long they'll be able to persist in this environment is going to be very important. If you had more funds in the hands of people who are struggling at the moment, that would support landlords and communities. And it's also important that municipalities, state and local in the U.S., be able to continue to employ their workers. So those entities have to run balanced budgets. The federal government doesn't have to balance their budget, but state and local entities do. And so if their revenues remain low, then they're going to start laying off workers, and then that's also going to reduce aggregate demand. So my outlook is premised on something like about at least $500 billion, if not $1 trillion of fiscal support, whether it comes, last week or in December. Eventually it's going to make a difference, but it's going to be important, at some point. Otherwise, I think the recessionary dynamics are really going to kick in a much bigger way.
Yeah, we have your chair, Jay Powell, speaking to Congress today, indeed at this time. Do you think that and the words of other FOMC members such as yourself will be enough to basically get this ball across the line and get genuine bipartisan support from Congress for the reasons that you've mentioned?
I think that we've made, I have gone out, my colleagues, other economists, anybody who's submitting a forecast, thinking about the trajectory of the US economy and the global economy, is thinking about the underpinnings that are going to support a stronger trajectory, putting more people back to work, and fiscal support is just fundamental to that. Now, it's democratically elected officials who are in charge of making those decisions, and they have a variety of potentially conflicting objectives. But in order to support the economy and get people back to work, keep food on the table, help keep schools open, and all of those things, I think that it's going to be fundamental, very important that we have additional fiscal support.
Let's get on to monetary policy, which is what you are responsible for. This flexible average inflation targeting, this new policy that was unveiled on the 27th of August, has really sent ripples around the world. If I could just challenge you a little bit on this, you were saying that it's not going to be for several years that we'll be up to 2%. So that'll probably make about 10 years at least before we get to the 2%. Bear in mind, you've missed this target up to now. How many years do you think of overruns would the FOMC take into account before you do start raising interest rates? You said a number of years. Can you be somewhat more precise about the parameters that you'd be looking for there?
Sure. So I think I am, very excited about our endorsement of our new long-run framework monetary policy strategy. I think that this, basically lays out a number of strategies that have been just really important learnings over the last many years, that monetary policy needs to be sufficiently accommodative to ensure that inflation expectations get up to a level that supports our 2% inflation objective. I think we've learned, since 2008 and before that, that the effective lower bound, the fact that interest rates can't go below zero. Central banks can embark upon negative interest rates, but only a little bit, minus 50 basis points or, something like that, perhaps. I mean,
and you've more or less ruled that out, haven't you? You've ruled out negative interest rates, so that.
Well, let me just say that back in 2008, when we were going through the great financial crisis and unemployment got up to 10%, if you looked at any reading from an interest rate rule like the Taylor rule, it wanted you to set interest rates at minus 4%. Now, we could talk about whether or not, you feel uncomfortable with zero interest rates, minus a quarter of a percentage point, minus 70 basis points. That's a big negative number, but it's not minus 4%. And this is part of the problem. If we're talking about how long do we need zero interest rates in order to get inflation up to 2% and average 2%, part of the reason is because we cannot set interest rates at minus 4%. We don't have enough monetary policy ammunition all the time. In an environment like this, we get stuck at zero, and then we want to do more, but we can't. After all, it's inflation. We're responsible for inflation. If inflation were 6%, and I tried to say, I'm not responsible for that, I can't do anything about that, that's wrong. That's wrong. It was wrong in the 70s. It's wrong today, but we were in that situation. When inflation is under our 2% objective, that's a monetary problem, and we need to be doing more. But when we get stuck at zero at the effective lower bound, then the challenges are even greater. That's why it's so important to have stronger fiscal policy, or just a strong economy with stronger real interest rates. Low interest rates are a global phenomenon, and that's really what the problem is, but we're all suffering through it, and we need to work to make sure that we have the strongest economies around the world that we can have.
Well, there's two obvious questions that flow out of that. One is, let's say we carry on with sub 2% inflation rates, even with the economy getting back to where we were before, say by 2022. So let's say we're still below 2% by, say, 2023, for the sake of example. It's going to probably take another 5 years, isn't it, after that, before the inflation rate goes sufficiently above 2% for you to start acting on interest rates. Would you say that's a racing certainty? We're going to be up until 2028 before interest rates actually start to rise again? And the second question geared to that, you said that there's not much ammunition left. A lot of analysts are saying, why don't you do more on the balance sheet? Your balance sheet was inflated up until June. It's remained around 7 trillion since then. Are you deliberately holding back further action on the balance sheet because you want the fiscal side to move first? Is that part of a sort of delicate minuet that you're doing with the congressmen and women?
So I appreciate your comment about the balance sheet, because I didn't mean to misspeak like that. I did say, we've sort of done about as much as we can. That's not true. What I meant was, when it comes to interest rate policy, when you're at the effective lower bound, other than promising forward guidance and indicating the contingencies whereby I'm just going to keep this at the effective lower bound for quite some time until I average 2%, till I overshoot. And then you're right to point out there's arithmetic at work. It's simple arithmetic. Until you get to 2%, you can't average 2%, right? Only in Lake Wobegon can everybody be above average, right? So we have to eventually get above 2%, and then for how long? And if then you are uncomfortable with anything too much above 2%, like 2.25%, then it takes longer to average to, doesn't it? If you go to 2.5,
it could be 2028.
Well, no, but I'm just saying, no matter how many years it is, if you threw in some 2.5s, you get there quicker than if you hold yourself to 2.2. And you really mean averaging. At some point, you begin to, have a discussion about what do we mean by averaging, and so that's still yet to be discussed. These are, new statements, new comments, and I think we'll be hearing more from everybody on that. But you're absolutely right. We can take action on the balance sheet, and in fact, at the moment, we are, purchasing $120 billion per month. Starts off because of to improve market functioning. Market functioning is doing pretty well. It's a little bit to make sure that things are accommodative at the moment. We'll have to have more committee discussions about that. The fundamental issue for all of this is, and it goes back to the last many years, we need to make sure that monetary policy is sufficiently accommodative so that we can hit our objectives, so that inflation expectations will be in line with our objective and overshooting. And I think that averaging 2% is a fundamental piece of that. We have to be in it to win it, as we used to say, and make sure that we're properly accommodative.
I just want to ask one more question on the general US front, and then I'm going to ask Mark to open up. And in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen around the world, please do submit your questions through our chat box. On the health side, we've all become now experts or semi-experts in epidemiology. You mentioned also the great efforts that are going on with healthcare workers, the vaccine and so on. Isn't it so, though, in a very blunt way, that we're going to have to accept extra deaths also in the coming winter as the price for keeping the economy going? Because you can't lock down big economies like the United States or European economies for a long period of time without suffering huge amounts of collateral damage. And there is a strong feeling that the cure in terms of lockdowns may be worse than the disease. Without getting too deeply into the health issues, is there not a trade-off that we have to accept, that there will be extra deaths this winter because you can't go back to complete ground zero in terms of running the economy into the ground?
So I think you're right to point out that we have all read up as much as we can, that we've listened to many, many podcasts and discussions about epidemiology and all of this. And I have to admit, there's just a lot I don't understand. And there are things that I thought I understood early on, and now I realize this is very complicated. And so there's tremendous uncertainty. I think at the outset, at some conceptual level at the outset, I would have thought the strategy and hope was everybody go home, stay there, let the virus disappear because nobody's interacting, and then you can go back out. Asia seems to have done this pretty well. And then if you've got testing, if you can make sure that when you find somebody and you can trace them and contain it there, then you could perhaps go back to a more normal way of life. If everybody wears masks, quite in a disciplined fashion and social distance, and you had some type of testing and tracing, then that seems like that could be effective. I will say in the US, we have a long history of, not liking to be told about restrictions on our behavior and things like that. And so I think that's been, quite a challenge for this. I think I just can't accept the strategy that we're going to willingly allow, tens of thousands of people to die just to keep the economy going. But I do accept that there are many precautions that we can take. I think there are many businesses. I point to the manufacturing sector regularly, and perhaps it's easier because it's an engineering environment and they know how to keep people safe, but it's more expensive. It cuts into productivity, but we have to find a way to get that, to work. We have to get to a way that people can be employed safely. They don't take it home and pass it along. It's even more challenging because it's not always easy to see the ramifications of your own actions, because you could be asymptomatic, you go along and you pass it along to somebody else, and it's a couple of cohorts after that where somebody comes down at a gruesome level and suffers tragically for that. So the externalities are really something.
Thank you. That's probably as far as we can go on the health side. I know I'm not going to ask our chairman from the United States, Mark Sobel. He's got a few tricky questions up his sleeve, I'm sure, about the balance sheet and the fiscal monetary mix. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Delighted to be here today. Well, I was very interested in your remarks on the difficulties of operating around the effective lower bound. That raises questions about what more can be done, which you've alluded to. The framework addresses some of that, but one issue is, are there specific ideas on being able to do more on quantitative easing, purchasing more, moving further out the treasury curve, or extending your time guidance? The framework is put in place forward guidance, but are there thoughts on that front about more that could be done there? It seems yield curve control is off the table for now. You've addressed negative interest rates. So is there more to be done, especially if we're still in the doldrums?
That's a fair question. I think our September statement has gone, quite a long ways, although I certainly take the point that markets and many people in the public would like to understand better, more specifics about this. I think we've laid out that, we intend to keep our short-term policy rate at the effective lower bound until we see really substantial improvement in the U.S. economy. That will undoubtedly be associated with global improvement in their economies as well, because we're really linked at this point in many, many ways. I think, we're looking to see employment, labor market strengthening, so unemployment should fall. I'm looking for unemployment next year. It's a pretty good forecast. It's 5.5%. I say there's some downside risks. I'm expecting some good things to happen in terms of vaccines and fiscal policy, and if those things don't happen, in that particular fashion, that's going to be an obstacle. But that's a path to a better outlook, which is still consistent with staying at the effective lower bound into 2023. We've got our summary of economic projections, and I think all but 4 of the 17 participants had no increase in policy rates through the forecast period. I think with other actions that we can take, like the balance sheet, like quantitative easing, I will admit that it's even more complicated now than I thought about it back in 2012 with our open-ended QE. I think that was a time when everyone was really demanding to know that the Fed was going to work hard to get the unemployment rate down. It was 8%, and we weren't sure it was going to come down very quickly at that point. And it was monetary policy. Fiscal policy wasn't going to come into action. Interest rates were higher at that point. Interest rates are low right now. 10-year Treasury rate is already very low. And so a question can be the portfolio balance effect, reducing term premia. They're already quite low. How much more are you expecting? I really think a lot of what our accommodated policies and asset purchases do is the signaling effect. We're going to stay with this. We're going to keep at it until we get inflation where it's supposed to be, till the economy is where it is. I think at the moment our forward guidance follows through on so much of that, and I think we have more to discuss in terms of additional quantitative easing. But having said that, I know that financial markets are currently working well with this level of flow purchases, and so there's a question about the flow, more or less, or how long that happens. And I think yield curve control sort of gets into that as well. How large would you like to do purchases, or if you make promises along a certain segment of the yield curve that interest rates will be down, maybe some of that takes care of itself without explicit purchases and things like that. I think that's interesting to look at.
Just to follow up a bit on sorry to interrupt, but just on that specific point about extending the purchases further down the yield curve, would that sound, what Mark was suggesting just now, would that sound, of all the different options, would that sound one of the best in order to make sure that long-term interest rates do remain at a very, very low level?
Well, I want to be careful about this. I did use language like that, but I didn't really intend it to be about, ultimately it's the duration of your purchases where I think this becomes more, of an issue. And so, back in 2011, rather than increase the size of our balance sheet, we increased the duration of our purchases. We sold our short-term assets and we bought long-term assets without changing the size of the balance sheet. But that had a portfolio balance effect because of the duration that we were taking out of the market. So the long end isn't important. I think yield curve control is much more likely to would be a statement about the short end of the yield curve interest rates up to, I don't know, we haven't had, it could be 6 months, it could be a year, it could be a little bit longer. And then what type of asset purchases somewhere along that yield curve would you be making? Now that would be, and you may not have to make those purchases if everybody understands that they're going to stay there. So the market, already could endorse that without the purchases. That's what I had in mind. I think purchases deeper, further out are a different question. And at the moment, 10-year Treasury rates are really quite low. I don't see any issues about that. But, these are conversations that we'll be having to talk about, clarify, see what we need to be doing.
Mark, do you want to dive back in there again?
I would like to shift gears a little bit on a subject that intrigues me greatly, and it's about financial stability risks with low interest rates and the search for yield. Many are arguing now there's a disconnect between the real economy and the stock markets and the capital markets, as you well know. It did seem that in March, the Fed had to go well beyond the Bernanke playbook, as I call it, to deal with dislocations, even in the Treasury and repo markets. And a lot of this has to deal with non-bank financial intermediation outside the Fed's remit. But one of the arguments is that macroprudential policy should be the first line of defense against financial stability risks. So I guess how worried are you about the market froth? Do you think the U.S. has adequate tools to deal with financial stability risks? And if macro-pru should be the first line, should monetary policy be used as a tool to lean into the wind against financial stability risks?
Yeah, this gets to be a very complicated conversation quickly because we're talking about somewhat different policy actions. And so monetary policy, certainly at the Federal Reserve, we've got a dual mandate. We're supposed to be providing monetary and financial conditions to support the attainment of maximum employment and price stability. Everyone understands and acknowledges that a stable, functioning financial system is important for achieving maximum employment, price stability, and moderate long-term interest rates, and so that is fundamental. But monetary policy really is about controlling the money supply. Of course, we do that by adjusting interest rates. We might do asset purchases and things like that. The financial regulatory policy is separate from the responsibilities of the Federal Open Market Committee, and that is, those responsibilities are, in the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Those are the governors. It's also the other regulatory financial agencies. So a very important question that always needs to be asked is, what's the state of safety and soundness of the banking system? Large financial institutions, what's their level of capital? We have stress tests that have been conducted regularly, going all the way back to 2009. I think that's been a tremendous innovation. And so we have a very good sense that the banking system today has, in the US and around the world, has more and better capital. We made adjustments to that. We have, SIFIs who are held to even higher capital standards. There are, capital buffers, and things like that. So having a well-capitalized banking system is very important. Having liquidity buffers is another important aspect of that. And so I think since Dodd-Frank and since the great financial crisis, we've all put more emphasis on that. But these are regulatory responsibilities that the supervisors are responsible for. When I think about the setting of monetary policy, and I recognize that inflation is well below our inflation objective for a very long period of time, and I know that we need accommodative monetary policy, and then that leads me to set interest rates at 0 to 1/4%. If I can't do that, if I have to artificially raise interest rates for some other objective, that will get in the way of us achieving our dual mandate. So I look to the financial regulatory authorities to, assure us that the system is sound, safe, and there are many safeguards in place.
That's a very clear answer, I think. That does show the prioritization. Mark, maybe one more question from you, and then we've got a lot of questions from the audience. So Mark, a quick question from you, and then we'll go to the audience.
Can you hear me? I've been having some difficulties in the last few minutes.
I can hear you fine.
Oh, well, if I could, here, you're the Chicago Fed president. You're in the middle of the great heartland of America. Manufacturing is a small slice of the American economy, and yet the heartland is a major source of manufacturing. So I was wondering what you're seeing in your region in terms of industrial production, manufacturing, and I'd be curious to know how U.S. trade policy is affecting your region.
Sure. Like I said at the outset, if you started at the beginning of this year, the fundamentals for the U.S. economy were really quite good, although the manufacturing sector was in a bit of a downturn, and there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty related to trade negotiations and tariffs and supply chains, and whether or not, if you had your supply chain on the wrong side of a border, you might have to bring it back into the U.S. or some other country that's more favorable at substantial costs. So I think that was limiting business investment quite a lot, and so manufacturing, was struggling. Having said that, the consumer was very strong. So auto sales, were very high, but oil prices were not so good. So heavy equipment manufacturing was struggling at times. Then the virus hit, and then, everybody sort of shuts down. I think we've learned that the industrial sector has been able to come back and produce safely. And so I would say that they're doing as well as global conditions and the health of the American consumer and the global consumer allow. Now, the current environment has turned upside down so many business models, right? So in Chicago, Chicago fundamentals are transportation related. The railroads come through. Global air traffic is really important, and moving goods around, through our region is really important. We have a substantial number of national business services that are provided with the city. Well, people are challenged in terms of where are you working from home. Got all these office towers, must be true around the world too. It's hard to get employees safely into an office tower, up the elevators, and we rely on public transportation. And so there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of difficulty, and I think that income inequality is definitely something that has got to be on all of our radar screens. It's been a big problem in terms of skills that are richly rewarded and other skills which aren't as rewarded anymore, and lower skilled jobs, and how we help to attract and retain additional workers into better jobs and share those benefits more broadly. That's very important.
We have on the trade side, if I could just press you on the trade, which Mark was asking about, we've had a little bit less ugliness lately on the China-US dispute. It's been replaced by ugliness elsewhere. Is the trade dispute still casting a shadow over all your industrial contacts in Chicago?
I know what you mean in terms of there hasn't been as much loud discussion about trade recently. That's because there have been other challenges. And so I
Hmm.
can't begin to guess what next year will hold on that front. And I think businesses they must be scratching their heads and trying to think about, how to deploy resources, scarce resources for the future. And at the moment, they're still trying to just, learn to thrive in the current environment, survive and then thrive in the current environment. And so future investments, those are discussions yet to be had, I think, for most business planning.
Okay, well, let's leave it at that. We've got a whole phalanx of very interesting questions. Now I'm going to start on the monetary side, something which is really absolutely tailor-made for you, Charlie. It is from Carsten Younis, Chief Economist at the Safra Sarrazin Bank. Would like to know, when is the averaging going to start? Is it going to start way back when you first missed the 2% target, or is it going to start now? Because that could make quite a difference, couldn't it, for your averaging to get to the 2% over an average period of time? When does the clock start to tick?
So I think first off, we have to, have more discussions about that. And I do think that, averaging 2 is certainly, our objective. We think that our 2% inflation objective should be consistent with averaging 2% over time, and overshooting 2% after long periods of undershooting. But I will say that we do not have an explicit formula for, is there a clock? When do we start averaging? Are we going to exactly average, or is it going to be a little bit more conceptual in all of that? I think these are details yet to be discussed. However, I would say that our task is challenging enough. If you simply start the clock at the beginning of this year, if you say beginning in the first quarter of 2020, how long will it take for us to average 2%? Because I'm looking for this year to come in at maybe 1.5%. I think it's going to be a slow climb up to 2% over a couple of years. Then we need to overshoot. And then, as I was suggesting before, if you're going to limit your overshoot to something timid like 2.25%, then it's probably going to take you to 2026 or 2028, like you were suggesting, in order to average 2%. So I would like to raise rates as soon as anybody. For me, that's going to be when the economy is very, very strong. Real interest rates are rising. I think that would be consistent with stronger fiscal policy, vibrant state and local government, employment and activity. We need a stronger economy so that real rates are higher and monetary policy in some sense follows the economy up with interest rates.
Yeah, so you're not ruling out that it could last until 2028, when both you and Eric would have passed your 20 years anniversaries if you're still on the FOMC. Yeah, I mean, it's completely open, isn't it, as you're saying? I've got another question linked to that, which is about the employment.
Let me just say, I think it's challenging. I think, the implications of averaging are like what I just said. What the committee is likely to do, we have only, we've sort of said, we're looking to get inflation up to 2%. And then after that, we could be raising rates and still have an accommodative setting of monetary policy. If you read the statement, that's in the cards. And so, we could start raising rates before we start averaging 2%. It's still, we need to discuss that. I think we need to be strongly accommodative, though.
The other element is unemployment. We have a question from Austria on where do you actually see maximum employment now to be achieved? What is your definition?
So I think an important part of our updated long-run framework is that we are going to seek vibrant labor market conditions. We are going to seek maximum employment. We are not going to be concerned if employment starts going very high. That is, if unemployment rates go very low. We had unemployment at 3.5% earlier this year, and we did not have inflation at 2%. Now, the reason why I don't worry about very high employment. I only worry about whether or not inflation is inconsistent with our 2% objective. And, when employment is doing wonderful things and more people are coming into the workforce and they're able to earn stronger wages because they have more work experience and they're acquiring skills. As long as that's consistent with inflation at 2%, that there's no conflict at all. So I don't know the answer to your question. I should have started off with that. 3.5% was, as my colleague Neil Kashkari is quick to say, we still had slack in the economy because inflation wasn't at 2%, certainly not sustainably at 2%. And I agree with that.
The other elephant in the room is debt and the budget. You and the rest of the FOMC, you are welcoming with open arms further fiscal spending. We have a question, Fiona O'Donnell of Mintel Global Research. She says, how far over budget can the federal government go? Is this something you're just going to cheerfully ignore, or what are the ceiling on the budget that you would actually see as appropriate? And she asked, at what point does US debt put the country at greater risk than a slow or recessionary economy?
So I think the first consideration has to be what are we currently facing in the US economy? What are the risks? And I think that if we fail to offer adequate additional fiscal support, it's likely that the economy is going to suffer through recessionary dynamics, which will add additional costs to the economy. And whether or not they're additional fiscal costs, they will be higher, because when we're in a recession, there's more safety net programs as well, but also costs to structural scarring of the US economy, lower growth, damage to households, household balance sheets, and all of that. And so I think initially it's very important that we have sufficient support wherever it comes from in order to get the economy back up to sustainable growth, potential growth rates, vibrant labor markets. After that, we need to take stock of our fiscal situation. I think we need to look at what are long-term interest rates at the moment. At the moment, markets are kind of saying they're not concerned about long-term US debt. 10-year treasury rates under 1%. Would you ever have guessed that, we could run deficits as large as this and 10-year treasury rates would be as low as this? I think, 10 or 20 years ago, you'd say impossible. Couldn't possibly be the case. Situation's entirely different. So we have to understand what those implications are. We do have to be nimble. We have to recognize that things could change, that the risk appetite of investors for certain types of debt could change. But on the other hand, investors are looking for safe assets. In the US at the moment, assets are very safe and people are willing to pay for that. I would say that there's a lot of additional investment that needs to be made in the US economy. Infrastructure, there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure needs. And I think that just as a business would borrow in order to make an investment that has a very high return on investment, the US needs to do things like that. And that's the kind of lending to the US government that I think investors would cheer on as well. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. They could have some implications for short-term debt. I think that they could be associated with higher returns on investment and getting the US economy in a better position. We do have to be careful though.
Yeah, we can obviously turn a blind eye to the inflationary risks for the time being. It's probably not only Milton Friedman, though, who would be slightly, if not turning, at least wobbling in his grave at the idea we're piling on all this stimulus, monetary and fiscal, without any worries about inflation. This brings me to a question from somebody who's an unashamed gold bug, and the questioner asks, is a higher gold price not quite a good way of signaling higher inflation expectations? I think this questioner wants you to say that you're in favor of a higher gold price, but what is your thought about gold?
Well, you mentioned Milton Friedman, and I think not everybody sort of remembers that, Milton Friedman, spoke out when when Japan had a very low inflation rate. Interest rates were very low in the early 2000s, and Milton Friedman always recognized that low interest rates by themselves don't necessarily translate into accommodative monetary policy. In fact, they could be restrictive. And Milton Friedman indicated that the Bank of Japan needed more accommodation in order to get inflation up. So I think we have to look very carefully at what the interest rate patterns are really indicating, whether or not we have accommodation, whether or not we're actually restrictive. Like I said, back in 2008, 2009, a Taylor rule indicated that we should have been setting the funds rate at -4%. We couldn't do that, but zero Zero was restrictive because we couldn't do that. Now, in terms of gold and a lot of assets, when you have real interest rates very, very low, there's that discounting effect that leads to a higher asset price. So you can see those prices move up. And then from there, the path of appreciation of those assets is very shallow in line with the lower interest rates. So you can get these asset level effects. And I think that's one way to interpret a bunch of asset valuations that we've seen over this long period of time when interest rates have gone down.
And the wobble that we had on the dollar, that people might think that's another sign that there is some worry about a combination of very high US debt somehow assailing the supremacy of the world's number one currency. And also, of course, there are some worries about the US presidential election. Are you worried about the dollar, which went through this wobble in July, August?
You know, I don't always like to take this cheap way out, but you know, I'm not really supposed to be making, you know, comments or predictions about the US dollar. That's the province of the Treasury Department. I think that you know, investors are looking around the world. They're trying to figure out where to make the best investments. Returns can be low in some places when interest rates are very low. Risk is really high. On the other hand, there are investments where people have you know, made a lot of money. I think all of those flows have an effect on relative valuations of currencies, and investors are looking for safe assets, and all of those things come into play, and also expectations of future monetary policy and what fundamentally is going to be the best economy in the world over the next several years. I think all of those things go into judgments like that. I can't begin to guess exactly who's, you know, causing
I remember
like that.
I remember a long time ago, an old fellow at the Bank of England, he once said to me, the Americans are only ever going to get worried about the value of the dollar when it goes down so much that they can no longer afford to stay at the Ritz Hotel. Because now that people can't travel anywhere, that could mean that people are never going to worry about the value of the dollar. So that seems to be like quite a good thought for us to bear in mind. But it's actually just that brings me on to another question from Patrick Flynn, who says that it goes back to what are you going to do next, if anything. The FOMC stand ready to do more if required. I know Mark and I have challenged you on this already, but is there something quite specific, Patrick asks, such as in the health area or say some political upsets? Is there anything quite specific? He says, under what circumstances would that be, whereby the FOMC, quote, stands ready to do more if required, end quotes. Can you be a bit more specific on that, please?
I kind of struggle, you know, with this because the current environment, if you go back to the, you know, 2008, you know, downturn, the great financial crisis, you know, it was a lot easier to see that that was a financial crisis that led to a deep downturn. There was over leveraging, there was more leverage than we anticipated. And, you know, there were financial challenges, there were monetary nominal challenges. The current environment is one where there's a virus out there, it is dangerous, it is transmitted too easily, and it doesn't allow safe interactions with other people in a social way that used to lead to commerce. And we can't go out and enjoy company and restaurants, bars, and travel like you know, indicated, and that's just having a huge dampening effect on the economy. I cannot set the federal funds rate at any level that is going to overcome people's unwillingness to go out and transact safely if they don't think it's safe. So if things were to get much worse, I just don't see monetary policy as a silver bullet. So I think fiscal policy support so that we can undertake safe behavioral actions. I think that substantial investments in medical safeguards, vaccines, therapeutics, helping us all understand the best ways to interact safely so that we can continue going about enjoying a good way of life and growing and thriving. Things like that are important. But when inflation is too low, then that means that we're somehow not accommodative enough, and we should be thinking about how we can get that right. But it, you know, sometimes the structural imbalances are so large that if they were reversed quickly, then the inflation situation would reverse quickly. So we have to understand the persistent downward headwinds against inflation versus short-term ones. And so I think that's what we're all going to struggle with. At the moment, I'm still optimistic that we're headed for a better outcome.
We've got 3 or 4 questions still to go in another 10 minutes, and I'm going to ask Mark Sobel to ask the final question, which is all about Fed independence, which is quite a big issue. But first of all, we have a question from Christopher Smart, now at Barings, who was part of the administration under the Obama years. And Christopher says, if you could choose for the package of fiscal support, which the Congress is currently deliberating, if it was up to you, Charlie Evans of Chicago, what is the best mix you'd like to see personally in a stimulus package? Would it be income support? Would it be infrastructure, which you mentioned before, or would it be tax cuts or something else?
Well, I mean, I don't want to, get outside of my lane, which is, monetary policy. I do think that, I do think we need fiscal support. I think that there's tremendous risk to the economy if state and local governments are forced to balance their budget with substantially lower tax revenues. I think that there's really no state or local government that's immune to this. I mean, either you are, raising income taxes revenue through income taxes and people aren't earning as much as they were before, or through tourists who are coming, your way and now they're not traveling as much. Property tax. I think everybody is challenged in that regard. And these are governments that need to balance their budgets. And so if they have to balance their budget and revenues are lower, they have to get their expenses down. They are going to lay off and fire workers. That's going to reduce aggregate demand, and that's going to hurt a lot. So I think that some support for state and local governments in the U.S. is very important. Frankly, I think infrastructure is evergreen. If it's got a positive rate of return, the social rate of return could be even higher in many, many cases. And so I think that that's always, an option if democratically elected officials are thinking about it and willing to do that. I think income support is probably useful in certain cases because we need to incent safe behavior. There are a lot of people who, lower moderate income individuals, where they're working as essential workers, they have to go into work. They have large families, perhaps in a tight, location. Their children need to go to school. Childcare is an enormous problem. If somebody could sort of provide safe and better childcare support, that would be an enormous help also for the economy. But I just think that the possible transmission of the virus continue to be so great. We're going into the indoor season with colder weather, and if we could, be safer and keep the virus down, we could continue to grow and thrive and get past this and on the other side to a vaccine.
Okay, just a couple of questions before I go to Mark for the final one, which is on Fed independence. But this one, in a way, foreshadows that. It's on President Trump, who, of course, did make a lot about infrastructure in his pre-presidential period. We've not seen much of that. The questioner says there's not been so much heard from President Trump lately about the Fed policies. It used to be very much flavor of the month that he would be commenting a lot on this in different ways. Is it a good or a bad thing that he seems to have turned his attention elsewhere over the last few months?
All I can say is that, for quite some period of time, going back to the late 80s at least, that the Federal Reserve has been able to do our job, focus on our dual mandate responsibilities without undue criticism from administrations, and that's been beneficial. We have to be accountable. We have to set out policies which help support the attainment of maximum employment and price stability, and we're better able to do that when we can look further ahead and take actions which might be politically unpopular but are absolutely necessary. I mean, if you go have a poll as to whether or not people like low interest rates, well, some people who borrow, do love them. Some people in real estate do, love them, and that's very helpful. But other people who are savers and they're looking for passbook savings and things like that, low interest rates are not what they care for. But if that's what's essential to get the economy going so that people can borrow and grow the economy, then we need to be able to put those policies in place, but explain why they're important and be held accountable.
Good. Well deflected, the question on President Trump. Gregory Poulos, who asks a question about modern monetary theory. Is that in fact what we now have? He is asking you. He thinks the currency is being debased as well because of the intention of overshooting the 2%. But what do you think of MMT in a nutshell?
I think we're doing our job as the central bank with interest rate policy, and Congress and the president are doing their job with fiscal policy. And if we had more accommodative fiscal policies and more relief, it's not even stimulus really, it's really relief, then we'd be better off. And I think that would help support the attainment of our inflation objective. Beyond that, I'm not really a deep scholar of MMT, and I just don't see that as what we're doing.
Yes, and in fact, just before Mark, Krishna Guha asked a question, which in a way you've answered already, but I'll put it again. Why haven't you yet delivered stronger guidance on QE in the form of a kind of QE3 economic outcome-based program? Krishna, as you know, is a great aficionado of QE. He asked, would that not be an appropriate next step?
Well, like I said, I think, at the moment, so I think the most important aspect of providing accommodation from the Federal Reserve in times like this is indicating we're, in it to win it. We're going to get inflation up to our 2% objective. And at the moment, I think our forward guidance on interest rate policies is really quite aggressive, sets the bar in a nice place and indicates that we're going to be accommodated. But at the same time, we are doing $120 billion a month of asset purchases. I think the judgment has to be, what are we looking for in terms of further reductions in term premia, portfolio balance effects if we were to engage in more asset purchases? I'm open-minded. We'll have discussions about this, but at the moment, I think the larger uncertainties are we going to get some fiscal policy stimulus? Are state and local governments going to be able to maintain their employment status and keep going? Are there going to be potholes in aggregate demand that are going to be problematic for us? Or are we going to be able to just, grow from this, thrive, hopefully get the virus under better control, and get to a point where we can all interact safely and enjoyably? Those are the most important things. At the moment, I don't see open-ended QE as providing an important part of that answer, but we're going to continue to talk.
That's a good answer. Question now from Mark on independence. And perhaps you could just keep in mind another question that's just come in, but keep this in mind. One of the questioners, he says, does the Fed play a role in, quotes, policing, end quotes, the US government's use of debt? But just bear that in mind. Mark, can I ask you to switch on your video and you can put this final question to Charlie? Please make the question fairly short because we've only got 3 minutes left.
Great. Your balance sheet has expanded. You've absorbed a good bit of the Treasury issuance. U.S. fiscal debt is up. Our politicians don't like to pay for what they want to spend. Do you worry about fiscal dominance putting you into a World War II through 1951 kind of situation? Do you worry that too much is expected of the Fed? And do you worry about a loss of Fed independence?
Well, something about the way you mentioned, do I worry that too much is expected of the Fed? In many years past, I used to either give speeches or help produce speeches for my predecessor, where I like to describe monetary policy as, we like to, provide monetary and financial conditions that help support maximum employment and price stability, but it's really the private sector that keeps things going, that grows the economy, good government provision of services, and consumers, doing very well. I think that's sort of the recipe for a thriving economy. And the Fed really ought to be playing a role in the background, where it's the private sector and workers who really keep things going. In the time that I've been president, though, we've been struggling with a whole host of issues, great financial crisis, very low interest rates, and we've had to learn to provide more accommodation. I never would have guessed that it would be so difficult to provide accommodation to generate 2% inflation. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, it was exactly the opposite. You worried about how you could stop inflation. And so there's something, maybe our balance sheet needs to be as big as it is. M needs to be big in order to get P up. I don't know. It is totally befuddling, but we need to provide accommodation. We need to be open-minded. We need to be nimble about changing circumstances, and the fiscal situation is one that can change. But as long as the global environment is one of low interest rates, so-called R* is low, we're going to be kind of stuck with this, and we're going to need to do more than most people are probably comfortable with. I would love to raise interest rates, but we need to be following the real economy up, not holding back the real economy. That's really crucial.
Well, that was a really good summing up. I'll say you avoided using the word independence. You used the word befuddled, though. It's the first time I've ever heard an FOMC member using the word befuddled. So that's a major first. You've also told us a lot about your thought processes. We're really very pleased. You're still learning after 13 years, it seems, which is a lesson to us all. May you go on another 13 years. May you get ahead of Eric at some stage. Perhaps, you never know what will happen. Thank you very much for taking us through all these different questions. I remember President Nixon said, we are all Keynesians now. It seems we are all epidemiologists now. We have to look at the health crisis first and foremost and help we get that under control one way or the other. Thank you very much indeed, Charlie Evans, for taking us through this. Thank you everybody around the world for giving us the benefit of all your questions. Thank you, Mark, for chipping in there. And we hope to see you soon physically, either on this side or the other side of the pond. All the best to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much.
All the best. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye from London. Goodbye from Chicago.